You're watching the Real Football Network. I'm John Pollard, and this is Real Football Analytics. Today we're talking about the resurgent Miami Dolphins. Now, as everybody knows, head coach Dan Campbell came on board 3 weeks ago to replace Joe Philbin. And since then, the Miami Dolphins have played remarkably better football on both sides from an offensive and defensive perspective. Is it a cultural change or an attitude change? Well, perhaps. Statistics and analytics don't necessarily help us quantify that. We did dig into the numbers to find out some philosophical and scheme changes that the Miami Dolphins have implemented that's helped them change the direction of their entire season. Let's take a closer look at the numbers. Now let's take a look at a comparison of the first 4 games of the season for the Miami Dolphins and their last 2 games under coach Dan Campbell and compare them first in the offensive categories. A few things we wanted to point out. Initially, what pops out is that the passing attempts for Ryan Tannehill have actually gone down, but his accuracy has gone up almost 30%, which 85.5% accuracy over the last couple of games versus the first 4 games of the season. Also jumping down to his pass yards per completion, that's gone up as well. What really has happened is that Tannehill's become significantly more accurate. He's throwing intermediate passes, and he's letting his receivers like Rashard Matthews and Jarvis Landry expand the play after the catch. And that's really the foundation of the passing scheme that the Miami Dolphins want to implement. We also want to jump over to the rushing game. You look at the rushing numbers, there's a complete change in balance. They averaged only 16 carries per game through games 1 through 4. In the last 2 games, they're averaging 34 carries per game. Obviously, with the more carries, the yard accumulation has gone up as well, averaging 214 yards on the ground per game the last couple of games. I really want to talk a bit about that. The Miami Dolphins have changed the way they're using Lamar Miller. Miller averaged 9.25 carries per game and 32.75 rushing yards for the first 4 games. And as a receiver through the first 4 games, he only saw 2.5 receptions per game for 21.75 yards. In the last 2 games, he actually is averaging 19 touches per game for a total of 177 yards. So the Miami Dolphins are getting Lamar Miller much more involved in terms of both the run game and the pass game. The final point I want to make about the change that we've seen in the Miami Dolphins offense is that they're not running Lamar to the edges. They're using him in between the tackles, taking advantage of his explosiveness to the line of scrimmage. And you can see that translate to the rushing yards after contact per carry. The first 4 games of the season, Lamar, when running to the edges, was only, or the rushing game for the Miami Dolphins, was only averaging a little less than 2 yards after contact. The last 2 games, 3.3 yards. That correlates with a game that's running, a rushing game that's more intended downhill versus running to the edges. It's a big change for the Dolphins, and certainly it's worked for them the last couple of weeks. Okay, let's take a look at the Dolphins from a defensive perspective. Again, we're comparing the first 4 games of the season under Coach Joe Philbin and his staff to now the team under Dan Campbell. Quickly, you can see a number of areas we're highlighting. First off, the most obvious, the points allowed per game has reduced from 24 as an average the first 4 games to 18 the last 2 games. Also, the total yards allowed has gone down significantly, almost 50 yards less per game over the last couple of games allowed by the defense. Now, I don't necessarily think there's a scheme change, even though Kevin Coyle, the defensive coordinator, was let go or relieved of his duties. Philosophically, I think the Miami Dolphins are just getting a little more healthier, specifically Cameron Wake, his hamstrings back, and you're seeing him able to get a lot more pressure on the edges. Obviously, with increased opportunities around the edges, that opens up opportunities for the interior linemen to get pressure. And we've seen that, and when we jump down to the overall sacks, the first few games, of course, the Dolphins famously didn't have any sacks in the first 4 games of the season. There were lots of concerns and conversation about the impact of Ndamukong Suh and this entire defense being underutilized. Well, we've seen that change. The last 2 games, they're averaging 5 sacks per game, which obviously changes the entire landscape for the imposing offense. Also, I'd like to jump down to the forced fumbles at the very bottom. The forced turnovers, obviously a big issue when it comes to improving team defense. The Dolphins weren't able to force any fumbles in the first 4 games of the season. They've already had 3 in the last 2 games of the season. Now, of course, we've talked about this. It's difficult to quantify cultural change and attitude change under a new coach. But what you're seeing, things like yards after contact per carry on the offensive side of the ball, deep ball opportunities happening from a passing game, and then jumping to the defensive perspective, more pressure on the quarterback, less yards allowed in the less total yards allowed, and opposing red zone percentages going down in terms of touchdowns allowed. That's all changed in the first 2 weeks. I think it's a matter of attitude adjustment, philosophical change, but also the Dolphins getting a tad healthier on the defensive side of the ball. Now, going into this week, of course, the Miami Dolphins face their stiffest competition. That's division rival the New England Patriots in a Thursday night matchup. The areas we talked about, an evolved running game and the big play potential of the passing game, those work into favor for the Miami Dolphins. In terms of rushing defense, the New England Patriots rank towards the middle to the bottom of the league in total rushing yards allowed per game to the opponent and rushing yards per carry allowed year to date. On the big play potential side, the New England Patriots defense also ranks 16th in the league in giving up big pass plays of 20 plus yards. The strengths that we talked about that have shown up for the Miami Dolphins in the last 2 weeks actually might work to their benefit as they face the New England Patriots. For Real Football Analytics, I'm John Pollard.